That brings us to item number 20, which is an informational update on the Maple Diversion and Feasibility Study for the Mouse River Enhanced Flood Protection Plan. Mr. Ackerman is here. Good afternoon, and take it away.
Good afternoon, President Janser, members of the City Council. My name is Ryan Ackerman. I serve as the administrator for the Souris River Joint Board. Here today to give you an update on what's happening with the Maple Diversion and the Western Tieback that's being contemplated as a part of the Corps of Engineers feasibility study. First, I want to just frame a little bit of context here. The map that's on the screens in front of you is the anticipated FEMA regulatory floodplain. And of course, the black lines that are on the screen now represent the phases that have been completed or that are currently in construction. So that's the work that is currently undergoing or on the ground. And while that work is being completed and built, there's work happening within the design teams to advance the following phases. On the west end of Minot, phase WC1, the Tierracita Vallejo levee, that work is going to be kicked off within the next couple of months by the Souris River Joint Board. MI4, the Maple Diversion, that work is currently being designed as a part of the feasibility study. And then phase MI5, the Rodeo Road levee, you're actually going to get an update following this agenda item from Mr. Bentz on the current progress related to that particular phase. But basically, once these phases are completed, the regulatory floodplain is going to go from what you see on the screen to this. So essentially, those initial phases are going to remove about 60% of the Minot residents from the regulatory floodplain. And it's also important to point out that the levees are being designed to the flood of record, so what we experienced in 2011. So I want to talk a little bit about the Maple Diversion. And to do this, I'm going to blow this up a little bit. One of the things that we want to point out here is that the realignment of 2nd Avenue is different than what was contemplated in the preliminary engineering report. So in the PER, 2nd Avenue passed through a closure structure and ran into the diversion, only to meet up with 6th Street. In the current design, we have pushed the flood control features to the southeast. And with that additional right-of-way, we're able to basically have 2nd Avenue running on the outside of the levee, thereby eliminating the need for a roadway closure structure, which is important in the context of managing overall flood risk. One of the things I want to point out as well is that the design for these improvements is about 20% complete, so I can say with certainty that things will change. Okay, so we are not anywhere near final with this. In fact, this is likely the first look that the public is going to have kind of behind the design curtain, so to speak. So in that spirit, we do plan to hold some public information meetings, likely 1 or 2 meetings in June with the Corps of Engineers, since this is their study and a part of their process that we are in partnership with them. So we'll be able to get additional public input at that time, and then basically go to work to finish up the design of this particular project. So as I step through this, I've got kind of a key map that's located in the upper right-hand portion of the screen, and the circle is going to kind of indicate the area of focus. So the first thing I want to talk about today is the upstream river closure structure. This is in the area just northwest of the Moose Lodge. Basically, the project starts at the east end of phase 3, and we are going to cross the river with a double sheet pile structure with a series of gates on it, and that is going to look something like this. So the rendering that's on the screen, this would be a rendering looking at the upstream end of that gate structure. Basically, it's going to be about a 15-foot wide structure. It's going to tie into paths on each end that sit atop the levee. And then the diversion structure itself will serve dual purpose. It'll serve as a flood control feature, but also an access feature to cross the river for pedestrians and also maintenance vehicles. A little bit more detail on the river closure structure. In terms of how it is designed vertically, we have 6 gates proposed to be on this structure. When the gates are open, there will be about 5.7 feet or so of clearance between the bottom of the gate and the normal, I'm going to call it the normal water surface elevation of the river, which is basically being driven by the Lowhead Dam at Oak Park. So about 5.7 feet. So this will be adequate for passage of small watercraft, canoes, kayaks, etc. At the highest flows, prior to the diversion being actuated, which is about 3,000 CFS, there would be clearance of about 3.2 feet. So it would be tight for a kayaker to get through there, but I still think it would be possible. There is a possibility of optimizing this and going larger, but we also have to balance that with the costs associated with doing so. So wanted to point that out. As we march downstream in the diversion, the next feature that's going to be encountered is the weir structure that'll be located just to the northeast of the Moose Lodge. A couple of features associated with that. First of all, we are going to be embedding a sheet pile weir within that structure to basically have a solid grade control. And then from there, the water will cascade down a rock riffle structure that'll be at about a 10-to-1 grade. And just to give you a feel for what a rock riffle looks like, this is a photo from one that was constructed in Minnesota. This is what it would look like under, I would say, a low flow condition. Under a high flow condition, this structure would be completely submerged, so you wouldn't see it. But under low flow conditions, that's what a rock riffle would look like. We are talking about levees on the north side of the diversion only. And one of the things that is driving that decision is that the Corps of Engineers has to justify incrementally the features. So in other words, levees on the north side are cost beneficial in the context of the way that the federal government looks at this. Levees or flood walls on the south side are not cost beneficial. So basically a levee and a flood wall on the south side would benefit the building that we're in, the public library, the 6th Street underpass, pump station, potentially the Amtrak depot. But the cost associated with those is greater than the benefits that would be associated with those. So from a federal perspective, those improvements are off the table. It doesn't mean that we can't advance those locally using state and local dollars. But the levee on the north side is going to be about a 15-foot average height. And with that, it's going to be about 110 feet wide from toe to toe. We're also looking at a railroad closure structure across the Canadian Pacific Railroad line. Some of the drawings from the plan set are on the screen there, but really to give you a feel for what this is going to look like potentially, here are a couple of examples. And there are a couple of different ways that these can be designed. The photograph in the bottom left is from an installation in Oslo, Minnesota. From a flood risk management perspective, this would be our preference. Because in this particular instance, you place a rubber boot around the rails and you stack aluminum stop logs. It's a fairly nimble installation. However, the railroads don't really like that because then it eliminates their ability to adjust the grade on their rails. And it also is a hard point, a stress point for when their trains cross that structure. So the railroads have expressed some concern with that closure type, so we're still in dialogue with them to figure this out. Another option is what you see on the bottom right-hand side. That's from East Grand Forks, Minnesota. Basically, in this installation, when a flood threat comes, a section of rail and the associated ballast is removed, exposing a concrete sill plate where your stop logs are basically installed from that sill plate going up. So it takes more time to implement that type of closure. We're also looking at 6th Street having a roadway closure structure similar to the structure that is located on the north end of the water treatment plant. So I think you're all very familiar with how those look. The diversion channel itself is going to be excavated to a depth of about 15 feet. A couple of things to point out with this on the left-hand side of the screen there. We are talking about a 20-foot bench from the toe of the levee to the start of the actual excavation of the channel. And that's being done primarily from a stability standpoint, from a geotechnical stability standpoint. And then the next bench, which I'll try out this. Next bench in this area is primarily for maintenance access and trail access. So that would be down on the diversion, and if there's a trail placed, it would be located on that bench. The third bench in this area is an aquatic bench, and that is there for safety. And the reason why it is there for safety is because under the current design of the diversion, this will be a normally wet channel under the current design. It's normally wet because the water surface elevation for this is being driven by the downstream weir, the Lowhead Dam near Roosevelt Park. So with that being the case, there would be just over 4 feet of water normally standing in there, and that aquatic bench is there such that at the edge of the water, you don't drop off into something deeper. If somebody happens to stray into the water, there's about a 10-foot bench to allow for a safe recovery. Looking at the other side, again, it's a symmetric type design with an aquatic bench, but then basically we transition up and tie into the approximate right-of-way line for the BNSF Railroad. One of the items that we're currently still wrestling with is how to configure 6th Street to keep it open. Just to illustrate a little bit of the challenge here, the roadway elevation at the bottom of 6th Street is about 1542. The elevation of the weir at Roosevelt Park is 1541.3. So from the water elevation that's in the river at low flows, we have 7/10 of a foot between the water elevation and the elevation of the roads. There isn't much hydraulic head to work with there. So as a result, water that backs up into the diversion channel would be on top of 6th Street if we had any type of modest flows going through the river. So to combat that, the current design has flood walls proposed on each side that would normally be wet. Okay, so there'd be some water along these flood walls just about all the time. How these would look, again in concept here, flood walls located along each side of the roadway. Consider the feeling being something similar to a guardrail on a bridge that is solid. And then the blue lines there represent anticipated water surface elevation. But this is something that we are trying to optimize, and we are considering other options, including placing a weir on the downstream end to keep this normally dry, but that does come with some other drawbacks as well. But stay tuned on that. The engineers are still cranking the numbers on that particular feature. One of the big challenges with the diversion is the railroads. So we have not one but 2 Class 1 railroads, plus we have Amtrak to deal with here. So the original design called for placing a bridge along CP rail along the current alignment of the railroad tracks. What we would have to do to accommodate that would be to build a temporary bypass line for CP rail. And logistically, that becomes a challenge for them. So what we are proposing at this point is building a new bridge and realigning the rail to the north of where CP rail is at. So the dashed lines that are on the screen in this area, for instance, those are CP rails lines. The solid lines up here, those are BNSF lines, and then the red lines would be the revised alignments for CP rail. So we are looking at that right now. One of the concerns from Amtrak is that the current diamond or crossing of the railroads is in this location, and we are shifting that approximately 200 feet to the east with this proposal. In doing so, we are decreasing the distance that they have for parking trains adjacent to the depot. So we have to work through that concern. So like I said, we are dealing with 2 Class 1 railroads plus Amtrak on this. So the downstream closure, very similar looking to the upstream closure. I won't belabor this, but this is a view from the upstream side of that as well. So on the left-hand side of the screen, that would be in the vicinity of the Broadway pump station that's currently under construction. In addition, we are looking at a western tieback levee as a part of the feasibility study. This is different than what is being proposed within the preliminary engineering report. And it's being done, again, because the Corps looks at this from an incremental cost justification standpoint. So the most efficient way in the federal government's eyes to do this is to basically take off from the west end of Phase 2 and head straight north. And if we didn't do anything farther west from here, it would put Tierracita Vallejo on the wet side of the levee until we would construct a separate system around Tierracita Vallejo. Talk a little bit about recreational opportunities, and I'll start with trails here just to illustrate the connections that are being proposed as a part of the feasibility study. The orange line that's on the screen represents a trail that would be located along the route of the flood protection. Starting on the west side, we tie into the end of the path on Phase 3, and that trail continues over the top of the diversion structure, on top of the levee on the north side of Moose Lodge. And once we get toward the inlet structure or the rock riffle structure, we start to transition down into the diversion. and that trail will be located on that second bench that I talked about earlier. That trail then passes underneath the CP rail bridge to avoid that conflict there. As we get towards 6th Street, the trail comes back up to grade, goes through the roadway closure structure, and then continues to the east on the north or dry side of that levee. As we get closer to 5th Street, we transition back up on top of the levee and go across the river closure structure near Broadway. The trail then continues underneath Broadway as requested by this council back in August, I believe it was, and will connect to the shared use path that's on the river side of the flood wall in Phase 1. On the aquatic side, there's also some opportunities that I think we need to vet with your guidance and also the guidance from the public. But one of the things that's being done on the west end of the project is to facilitate the drainage of the Moose Park dead loop. We are excavating or proposing to excavate a channel that would create a hydraulic connection directly to the river. So we would anticipate that the Moose Park ponding area could be a potential watercraft access point for canoes and kayaks. Additionally, like I mentioned earlier, the current design of the diversion does call for a wet bottom to the diversion. That ponding area, that backwater ponding area, could serve some sort of a recreational purpose as well. Other considerations here, I mentioned that the federal plan will not include anything on the south side to reduce flood risk to City Hall, the library, et cetera. But there are options that can be implemented. The depiction that's on the screen is just a rough configuration of what one concept might look like, basically using a combination of flood walls, road raises, and levees to protect critical city infrastructure like the library or the 6th Street pump station. But this is currently not being contemplated as a part of the federal project. As I mentioned as well, the west tieback is a change in scope from what was in the preliminary engineering report. The map that's on the screen is from the PER, and that thick blue line represents the alignment that's a part of the feasibility study for the western tieback. As the design for the Tierracita Vallejo system advances, I would say there could be a chance that the western tieback will be eliminated from the federal project because its utility would basically go away if we have Tierracita Vallejo in place. Talk at a high level of costs here based on what we know today. The total project cost for this project, the west tieback plus the maple diversion, is about $85 million. I have to say that this cost is not fully cooked yet. It's still undergoing some QA/QC review, but this is what we know as of today. So I wanted to give everybody an indication of where we are at as of today. If this project is federally authorized and appropriated, up to 65% of the cost would come from the federal government, so about $55 million, and then the balance would be split based on current cost share policy, 50-50 between the local entities and the state of North Dakota. Want to say that one of the things that we've done recently with regard to our approach to the feasibility study is we've advanced the schedule for delivery of the chief's report from April 2019 to December of 2018. We are pushing this schedule forward to try and get into the next WRDA bill that's going to be considered by Congress, so we can check the authorization box at a minimum. So that is our plan. Okay, so one of the things that's always in everybody's mind is where are we at globally with regard to budget? I'm going to talk a little bit about where we're at in the context of the commitment that the state of North Dakota made in the last legislative session. In House Bill 1020, the state illustrated its intent to provide up to $193 million over the next 4 biennia for improvements located within the city limits of Minot. That cap does not apply to anything outside of Minot. So if we just take that $193 million, subtract out the authorizations that the Water Commission has made to date of about $59 million. Also, Mr. Bentz is going to get up and tell you that the Phase MI5 is going to cost about $44 million. You're going to take off the design that's already authorized and 65% of that, so about $26 million is going to come from the state. The city acquisitions team has indicated a need of about $8.2 million of additional state funds to complete acquisitions within the initial milestone, or the initial footprint of the work in West Minot. And then if we look at, basically, if we assume that there's no federal money that comes into this project and that the money has to come from the state to build the diversion, it would be about $55 million from the state, meaning that we would still have $45 million in state commitment to start working on portions of the project in East Minot. So this is good. This is good. And this is basically because we have been able to capitalize on cost savings associated with the first 3 phases. There's a significant cost savings associated with removing protection on the south side. Now, granted, it leaves City Hall at risk. It does. But in terms of priorities, that's where we need some direction from the City Council, whether you want us to focus on East Minot or on City Hall. Additionally, the original budgets were based on Tierracita Vallejo being a part of the city system. Well, literal interpretation of what was passed in House Bill 1020 says that they're out of the city limits. So that particular system wouldn't be counted against the cap. So there would be about $45 million of remaining state funds through June of 2025 if we don't get federal money. If we do get federal money, the full federal appropriation, that could be up to $85 million to do work in East Minot. So the next question, I'm sure, is what's it going to take to get work done in East Minot? So the next likely focus of the flood protection efforts is going to be in the area around Eastwood Park, where we can basically construct a standalone system that ties in high ground to high ground. There are 3 components to that. A component in downtown, some work through Roosevelt Park, and then some work south of Volker Road. That's going to remove an additional about 15% of Minot residents from that regulatory floodplain. And then casting our gaze beyond that, of course, then there's the balance of the work in East Minot, North Roosevelt Park, North Volker Road, and then the 27th Street diversion. So in terms of costs of those phases, what we're estimating at this point is the total cost of that next milestone around Eastwood Park to be about $86 million. Okay, that's the total cost. The state share is about $57 million at current cost share, and assuming the appropriation is there. So in the previous slides, when I talked about there being state funds of $45 to $85 million, under the commitment that's currently on the table from the state, there's a chance that we could build all of Eastwood Park, depending on if appropriations come through from the federal government. Okay, at a minimum, we're going to be able to get a long way there toward getting that next phase done. Maybe not complete within the next, before 2025, but I think we'll be going to be able to get a long ways there. That third milestone is estimated to cost about $166 million. So in the event that we do secure federal appropriation for the diversion, there is a chance that we could be chewing away at a portion of this particular milestone as well. So all in all, I think from a monetary and budget perspective, I have good news to report to you today. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you have.
Lots of questions. Mr. Mayor.
I have 2 questions. Getting back to the floodgates for the Maple Street diversion, at what CFS do the gates close?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Mayor, the intent is to close those at 3,000 CFS, which is approximately a 1 in 10-year event.
Okay. And then I don't understand the purpose of the rock riffle. Could you explain that briefly?
Yes, so basically the diversion channel, as it comes off of the river near the Moose Lodge up to about the Moose Lodge itself, is relatively shallow. And we're trying to keep it shallow to minimize costs. However, we have to get underneath the railroad with our conveyance, so we have to go deeper through that railroad section, and then we want it to basically drain toward the river on the other side. So we have this delta, this elevation delta, that we have to make up. Now, there are several ways to do it. The rock riffle is basically it's a more economical way to cascade that water down than through doing it through hard concrete structures.
Okay, Alderman Sitma.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ryan, very happy to hear cost savings and looking at prices. Much different than what we did even a year ago. But one of the questions that I think we often hear, especially just on the day-to-day side, is the regulatory floodplain. And it was mentioned specifically, and I just wanted to see if we have heard anything from the last appeal about the regulatory floodplain. Kind of different area, but same issue here.
Mr. Chairman, Alderman Sitma, I'm wondering if your city manager would want to give an update on that, or if you want me to field this one, Tom.
You want to take a first stab, and then we can.
Sure.
All right.
Okay, so we've been working in tandem with the city and with the county on challenging some underlying assumptions made by FEMA and its contractors with regard to how the maps were developed. And you guys have seen that, and that was the premise of the meeting with Administrator Long. Within the last week, we did have a meeting. I was their city manager, Mr. Jonason, Mr. Meyer, others from city staff, crew from the Water Commission, people from FEMA. I would say that 80% of what we had provided by way of comments have been addressed with their process. So they acknowledge that some of the initial mapping was not up to the current specifications that they have, and we pointed that out to them. As a result, they're going back through their process, and the message that we got from them is that the earliest that the maps would go effective would be in March of 2020. So at a minimum, the time frame is delayed, and also there's a fairly sizable reduction in the floodway that they're showing on some revised maps, but that's all provisional and preliminary at this point. But how'd I do, Tom?
You did great. I just wanted to add, maybe we'll have a more specific number, either of properties or in percentage, to share at the city manager's report at the next council meeting on impacts to those structures and properties that were either removed or added, and the net change in regard to the incorporation of the revised guidance that was used in the mapping, which I want to credit Mr. Ackerman and his colleagues for helping to spearhead. So he's done a very nice job with this.
Just one follow-up,
Yes.
Mr. President.
Yes.
Thank you, Ryan, for that. And then a question, if we are taking a look at the Maple Diversion itself with 2nd Street and putting it outside of, or rather on the dry side of the levee system, is there any kind of preliminary thought, and I know this is somewhat cantankerous to even ask, I guess in the sense, is our footprint that we've done for acquisitions within that area sufficient from what we're looking at now?
Mr. Chairman, Alderman Sitma, the acquisition footprint that was identified is being adhered to at this point. So we don't feel like any additional acquisitions are going to be necessary to construct the Maple Diversion. There may be some small-scale slivers here and there for tracks that we need, right away to accommodate a sidewalk or a portion of the road. But based on what we know today, the acquisition footprint is adequate. I will say, though, that there are elements within the process that could change that. Sure. So I would be remiss if I said that the footprint is locked in with certainty. The railroad is the major driver of a lot of this, the railroad considerations. So if we have to reconfigure the way that the railroad tracks cross this diversion and it results in a loss of hydraulic efficiency, there's a chance that the diversion would have to get wider. But again, the message that we've delivered to the designers is basically that the acquisition footprint shall not be expanded. That's
right.
That's what we're shooting for.
Alderman Straight.
Thank you, Chairman Jansen. Ryan, can you go to the west side of Minot, that west tieback, and kind of the question mark there? I'm curious about the map and the discussion about the Maple Diversion, if we need it or not, and
This one?
yeah, and then as it pertains to Highway 83 over there, Teresita Vallejo.
Jump forward here. I think this one captures it probably better. So the feasibility study option is outlined in the dark blue line. And basically, the costs associated with that are cheaper than the additional benefits that would be received if we constructed the Tierracita Vallejo levee. So as a result of that, the federal interest will be in the construction of the West Highback, and it'll be a locally driven initiative to construct Tierracita Vallejo.
Okay. I guess the reason I bring it up, and you can maybe point out with the red cursor, where, is it capital RV? Right down there?
Mr. Chairman, Alderman Straight, capital RV would be off of this map. They would be to the south
Okay.
off the screen.
There was a agenda item from planning on Monday, and that's why I just wanted to make sure I'm there, just for my own food of thought. And then second, what was the value-added engineering cost savings by moving the Second Avenue bridge or street that Alderman Sitma kind of touched on a second ago?
Mr. Chairman, Alderman Straight, we have not quantified what the cost savings of that one particular change would have been.
Gotcha.
You know, it's probably in the neighborhood of $500,000.
All right.
If I was to take a wild guess at it.
And I guess just finally, thanks, Mr. Jonas and Mr. Bentz. Over the last year, I've spent some time in Bismarck with you all. I'm excited to know for folks in Eastwood Park and folks moving east that there's clearly, hopefully, some money available. We're grateful. Thank you.
Okay.
Alderman Janser.
Alderman Olson.
At what point would you be looking for guidance for protection of this building and the library?
Mr. Chairman, Alderman Olson, I wouldn't say that there's a set time frame, I guess, with regard to what the joint board has established for priorities. They haven't taken this particular item up, but it at least begs the question from our standpoint, because I mean, I recognize the importance of the library, of City Hall, the 6th Street pump station, but I also recognize the importance of the people that live in East Minot. So I think it would be helpful for us to hear from the elected leaders of this city to understand your priorities, and then we can make that happen. So, but no, I wouldn't. There's not a set time frame. We aren't advancing the design of anything on the south side at this time.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Alderman Wolski.
President Janser, thanks. Mr. Ackerman, you know, to offer my perspective on that particular issue is I think back to 2011, we did a pretty good job of protecting City Hall and the library with temporary flood protection measures. You know, I don't know what that cost or how quickly that can be implemented, but certainly it doesn't look like a wide area. We've got roads. I mean, if that's a possibility for us into the future in the near term, you know, I think there's maybe some wisdom in operating with that mentality and the temporary, you know, throw them in place quickly, clay dikes to protect this area if we have to address that. I think my larger concern and what I think I would like to see moving forward is as soon as we can get there, design clarity for the southeast side of town. For those residents who are still wondering, you know, because we're only at the 10% preliminary engineering report, you know, on the entire plan, you know, we probably have to get to 30% or 60% to know exactly which houses we're going to need, which properties we're going to need. You know, I think that's, if I were to imagine myself living over there, that's information I would want to have. I would want to know as soon as possible how I'm going to be impacted by this, whether I'm going to be impacted by this, because everybody knows it's coming. They just don't know the details. And the other element of that too is you know, we have teased this idea of a substantial amendment using the NDR dollars and to getting better access for acquisition dollars from that program from the federal government. In conversations I've had with Mr. Zakian, he has suggested that in order to be able to access those dollars for that purpose, we need to have that design clarity. So from that perspective and from the sake of the citizens' perspective, you know, my interest would be in seeing getting the completed design for even that end of town moving as soon as it becomes feasible in the entire scheme of things. But that's where my priority would sit, I guess.
Any further questions for Mr. Ackerman? Okay. Thank you very much. Excellent report. Appreciate it. Well done.